Welcome to the Freeman's Podcast. I'm your host, Joel Whitmire. Join us as we explore liberty, truth, and current events from a biblical worldview.
So when you were growing up, when did you first start learning about the American Revolution? Or how did you start learning about it for the first time?
Oh, wow. As you said that, man, I know exactly where I was and what I was doing when it happened.
Yeah. I figured you probably did. I was like, Joel's probably has an origin story behind this, He'll write it in his memoirs one day. I remember when I was a child.
Yes. Maybe something like that.
Put me on his knee and said, America. Anyways.
My brothers and sisters, my brothers specifically, teased me because, I've always been big on the American founding and liberty and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. If our listeners haven't picked up on that yet. Yeah. Excuse me just a second. Just fix my chair. But they teased me because I remember one day my brother looked at me and was like, Joel, do you realize that the address to the house that you were brought home from the hospital to was Liberty Grove? And I was like, dang, no. And he was like, and now you're going to Liberty University? And I was like, wow. Yeah. I didn't put those together. Thanks for that. I was probably 4 or 5. I can remember stuff so well.
It reminds me of in the, all the Greek heroes or the Greek gods or Roman gods or something like that. There's always these stories or the Roman emperors, all these mythical stories about how when he was 2 years old there was a crow died and shot eggs on the ground and we knew Nero was going to doom it. It's like they always go back to this from when he was a kid. Yeah. He was destined to be this way, right? And then for you it's one day they're going to be and he was the leader of the Second American Revolution.
Oh, heck no.
And from the house he was brought home to was Liberty Grove. I can see it now.
What's funny as you're talking about this? My dad was the chaplain for a guy who was running for Congress while my mom was pregnant with me.
Dude, it's literally writing itself. The movie is already written. In 3,000 years, after the nuclear holocaust, and there's nothing left, right? Where you have these random sources, it'll be 1 page remaining of
someone's gonna find my
the
hard
Second
drive.
American Revolution or whatever, you know what I mean? And then they're gonna be this is what they're gonna write about you. They're gonna create this legend.
I have no intentions of a Second American Revolution.
Yeah, I know, right? You're gonna get flagged. It's that's hilarious. So
I'm as you're going on about this, my brain is remembering all these things. I'm oh my gosh, this is sounding so weird.
That's hilarious.
Okay, so I was 4 or 5. I was homeschooled. And part of that was we had these coloring pictures that we would do, and then it'd have a little blurb of history to them, and mom would read it to us. Nice. And yeah, I can remember drawing or coloring, not drawing, but coloring in the battle at Concord Bridge. I can picture it in my brain right now.
Did you just only use red and blue?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Because mom and I, gosh, this is gonna, wow, I'm remembering so much.
That's so funny.
They had these army men that were American Revolution army men.
Dude, that's insane.
Yep.
That's actually insane.
Yeah. So they had all that. One of my favorite movies growing up was Disney's Johnny Tremaine.
Yeah.
With the Boston Tea Party.
So I've never seen the movie, Disney Johnny Tremaine, but I'd had to read that.
You've got to watch that movie. Yeah. It is actually a really good movie. Even by today's standards, it's just a classic Disney. But Disney was a big patriot. He loved the American founding. Yeah. It covers the Boston Tea Party. It covers the Sons of Liberty. It covers Paul Revere's Ride. It covers the battles at Lexington and Concord. It's all the beginning stuff. and it's from the perspective of this fictional character,
Right.
Johnny Tremaine.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a great movie. But that was like one of my favorite movies when I was that age, coloring those pictures, playing with the army men. Me and my brothers would go outside with our pop guns and our cap guns.
I get to be George Washington.
Yes.
Patrick. Yeah, I get to be Patrick
I didn't know
Henry.
who Patrick Henry was at the time, but my dad had told me about George Washington, and I wanted to be him.
You're like, he's super cool.
Oh, I loved George Washington.
Yeah. That's so funny, dude. That's hilarious.
So yeah, that you asked the question, and I actually, until this moment, like I was like, wow, that was actually pretty early for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so wild.
So you can imagine
go ahead.
why I loved The Patriot when I saw it.
I know. Dude, that when your dad finally showed you The Patriot, you were probably like, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen.
Because everything Revolutionary War to that point for me was Johnny Tremaine. And then The Patriot. Whoa.
Big difference.
Yeah. A little bit more bloody. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so funny.
So amazing. But what were you going to say? Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, like, you hear all these stories about, parents like wanting their kids to be like chess players, like world-renowned chess players, and so they like put like chess pieces in their kids' like cribs and stuff. This is real things people
Is
have
it
done.
really?
Yeah.
Oh wow.
They like, and there's something to it. Like they say that like you kind of put this stuff in front of your kids, they're gonna be like attracted to it. And so I like to think of your dad being like, my son is gonna be a patriot. And so he was like, I'm gonna lay this all out for you,
Like even before I could read, I'd find books at the library when we'd go there that they were kids' books about the American Revolution.
Wow.
And I would just stare at the pictures for hours. So yeah, I'm just saying, you're bringing it up, and this is just becoming more and more funny to me. But
Joel just,
there was no conspiracy with my parents. We just loved America.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
Yep.
That's so awesome. My first memory of learning about
I was going to ask.
Yeah. Well, I was going to tell you whether you wanted to know or not.
I did want to know.
Yeah.
You've exposed me enough.
Yeah. Mine's way less cool than that. It's because I'm not as patriotic as you. It's not as ingrained into my memory. Although I did have army men growing up. Like I feel like a lot of us did. Like our age
that was
people,
my
like army
thing.
men were really normal to have. But all mine were World War II guys, and that explains a lot too. Because I've always been way more interested in World War II. It's like I never had the Revolutionary guys. But anyways,
darn.
Yeah, I know. Sad. It's probably not the first time. I know it's not the first time I learned about it, but the only thing I think about when I think about learning about the American Revolution when I was a kid is the show Liberty Kids on PBS.
Dude, that was a highlight for me too.
Yeah, that show was awesome.
It was awesome.
It was so good.
You know what's bad though?
What?
By that point, I had read enough that I was already nitpicking that show. I'm not kidding. But I still loved the show.
I will never, no one should ever doubt Joel's authenticity.
Yeah.
It's like little 5-year-old Joel's like, well, actually, that's not what Benjamin Franklin did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nope.
No.
Thomas Paine wasn't a nice guy.
Yeah, so I don't remember anything else. And I'd still say, because like my American history is like not good, like I think everything that I think about the American Revolution is just what I learned from Liberty Kids.
Well, I'm glad we're doing this for your sake and anybody else who had that
I'm learning
kind of...
a lot right now. This is the first time I've learned some of this stuff. So
I hope what we're seeing is that the Americans are actually pretty justified in being upset.
Yeah, it's been eye-opening for sure.
For sure.
So where did we leave off last time?
So yeah, we had just finished going through the intolerable acts or the coercive acts, which, just to recap on those, because I don't want to go on all the other ones. After the Boston Tea Party, the British Parliament passes these 4 acts. It was the Boston Port Act, where they shut down the port, sent troops to Boston, instituted martial law, and just took complete control over the city of Boston. And then the Massachusetts government gets disbanded. They disband the charter. They abrogate it, is the word that's used. So that charter is back from 1691.
Jeez.
And
that's crazy.
They reduce it to the level of a crown colony. They replace the elective local council with an appointive one, and they enhance the the powers of the military governor, Thomas Gage, and they forbid town meetings without special approval. So so they shut the port down. They completely overhaul the government of Massachusetts. Then they have the Administration of Justice Act, where this now martial law governor, if he doesn't feel like a trial can be done in a quote unquote indifferent way, then he can send the trial to another province or to Great Britain. And they started using language like province.
Yeah. I think that one's really fascinating because it's kind of indicative of like, them passing that act means that most likely they were already aware like what the sentiment was in the colony.
Right.
And so there's this like fear that, or understanding that, hey, like we have to do away with this because we don't think we'll be able to have a partial jury.
Right.
Because these people, the colonists are going to be sympathetic to the people who are on trial. So it's really fascinating. Like I feel like that probably reveals something about the temperature in the air.
Well, think about that attitude. You have a right to trial by jury of your peers, which this act takes you away from that. Right? If you don't trust the system, you are the one who's being unjust here. And so out of the gate there, it's injustice right away, just with the possibility of doing this to somebody. So yeah, it is like a good measure of the temperature of the atmosphere.
Yeah.
So that's the third one. The fourth one is they reinstitute the Quartering Act. And this is the fourth and final of the intolerable acts, or coercive acts. And that led to, in the same year of 1774, from September 5th to October 26th, the first full Continental Congress meets in Carpenter's Hall, Philadelphia, which Carpenter's Hall is where they will meet again to go ahead and do the Declaration of Independence, which I just realized, for the sake of our listeners, if you're just coming in, we are on a series on the Declaration of Independence.
It's good that you're saying this. They're probably, if they're here, they know why they're here, but it's good to reiterate.
Well, some people jump in. Some jump in the middle of series, so I just want to make sure that this is part two. The first part, we covered the history that is led up to this first Continental Congress, leading up to the second, where we get the Declaration of Independence, and then we will break down in detail our Declaration of Independence.
Nice. I'm excited to do that.
I am too. I'm looking forward to that. So you have this Continental Congress. They meet, and this one, what they do here is they formally declare I can't read my own writing. They formally declare that the colonists should have the same rights as Englishmen, right? So it's this public, formal declaration to England, like, hey, you have crossed the line too many times. We have the same rights as you. Stop it. And one of those rights, and this is something we really hammered on in the last one, and I'm going to keep hammering on it, is that the Constitution of England recognizes that the rights and liberty of the people and their property, that as a free Englishman, no king or parliament has the power to take or infringe upon the liberty or property of the individual man without his consent, either directly or through a representative. That is an ancient right of the English people. And so they are saying here, we have the same rights as you. Parliament, you don't have the jurisdiction. Constitutionally and by ancient right, you do not have the jurisdiction to be passing these laws, to shut down Boston, to do these things. And all the other colonies are now uniting because of that and going, wait, they can do this to them, they can do it to us. With this first part, they declare formally and publicly, hey, Great Britain, you have crossed the line. We have the same rights as you. You are breaking the Constitution of England.
Right. Yeah. This is like this is a total little rabbit trail, but it just made me think of it because I find this really fascinating. I just recently read a book I'm in a global imperialism class. Right. And you know me, I'm like, I couldn't really care less about that sometimes, but modern history just doesn't strike my fancy. But what's fascinating is we were just reading a book on the decolonization of French Algeria, which is African.
Boring. Sorry. I'm sorry.
Well, it's not something, I mean, it's like just not the sphere of like the world I'm interested in.
Yeah, no,
but
me either.
It's it was really fascinating because the aspect of the decolonization, which took place in like the 40s through 70s.
I want to clarify something real quick. What I find boring is not the decolonization. That's actually fascinating to me, because when these imperial powers actually willingly gave up, cool.
Yep.
It was more just like, it's a very obscure place to have to read about.
Yes, it is. But so, and it is fascinating because it's such a modern thing. Like people don't realize that like the colonization of all these like French and British like African states were taking place up until like the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Like it's very recent.
Well, go figure that there's so much trouble there.
Yes, it's a lot of stuff. It's literally unresolved. Like you still have people that are alive from some of these like French colonies that in the 90s that are being like dissolved. So it's still, there's a lot going on there. You know, the blood is still boiling. Like it's come down to
they're
a
still
simmer.
Upset. Yeah, I would be too.
But what's fascinating and what reminded me why I feel like this is relevant is dating back to, I don't even remember the date because I'm a bad historian, but when France declared Algeria as, well, so they never technically declared Algeria as a colony originally. All of the like African and like Indochina and like all of France's like sub colonies, they actually don't classify them as that. They classified them under their law as a part of Greater France.
Oh, wow.
They're just an expansion of France.
Okay.
So why this is relevant is that when Algeria, these sort of like revolutionaries in Algeria come to the French government petitioning for the same rights as the rest of France, French citizens, what the French government actually does is they say, no, you're actually a colony. And they redefine Algeria as a colony to drop their status as being part of like regular France through the process of decolonization. So they actually kind of like turn them into a colony so they can decolonize them and like basically not deal with the problem.
So they could decolonize them?
Pretty much.
Or was it a big so they wouldn't see them as equals?
So that was like the first and foremost thing, but then decolonization was part of the intent behind that.
Okay, so they were wanting to turn it over, give them independence,
right?
But they didn't want to see them as equals.
Yeah,
man.
So
French.
Yeah, but why I think this is relevant to this discussion, wanted to bring it up, is I think there's an interesting parallel between like that strategy and what the British do to the American colonies in these, like what we've been discussing in these podcasts, where like they have this sort of like historied like status, right, or at least supposed status. In the case of Algeria, it's like they weren't really a part of France, but they were at least told they're supposed to be able to. And so like then you see like the government coming in and saying, no, we're going to actually like drop your status back down.
Okay, so I know I just said something and picked on the French. More that French government. I'm not picking on the French people.
Yes.
I need to clarify that.
Right.
I feel like I'm having to clarify myself. I'm sorry, everyone.
It's okay. It's good to clarify things.
Yeah.
But so again, kind of going back to this, it's like you see like a similar parallel in the way that Britain was willing to come in and say, like, you have this long history, like status as a charter colony.
Right.
And then now we're going to drop you down to a crown colony.
Yep, exactly.
And that in order to basically like justify in our eyes like what we're doing, right? Yeah. And it's tyrannizing what it is. I know that was really random, but I thought that was interesting.
It's a modern example of something similar happening, and it's terrible for the people of Algeria. But they are independent now, and I hope the best for them.
Yeah. And I don't know what's going on over there.
I don't either now. Well, it's like I said, it's obscure. You don't hear about, and that's a problem. It's a problem that places like that are obscure.
Yeah.
But
I know they're still dealing with that stuff, like in the UN. Yeah. Like that's a constant conversation. Is like these relations between those countries in Europe,
and France is in a lot of trouble now with immigrants, and it might have something to do with that.
Yeah.
So, man.
Good stuff.
What goes around comes around.
Yeah.
So, back to this, when the First Continental Congress, they formally declare that the colonists should have the same rights as Englishmen, and then they adopt a declaration of personal rights, including life, liberty, and property, assembly, and trial by jury, which is just in the face of all these tyrannical acts.
Right.
This declaration, this is not the Declaration of Independence, but this one for the First Continental Congress, it also denounced taxation without representation and the maintenance of the British Army in the colonies without their consent.
Yep.
So it's everything we've been talking about. It's this massive, formal, unified pushback against Great Britain, the Parliament of Great Britain. Like, you have crossed the line. We are resolving. This is who we are. We have the same rights, same liberty. These are our rights: life, liberty, property, assembly, trial by jury. You can't tax us without representation, without our consent, and you can't force us to maintain the British Army without our consent. Right.
Yeah.
So, just a lot of our sources, they're coming from the American Battlefield Trust. We have the Library of Congress. We have the National Archives. We have some stuff from the Jamestown Settlement Museum. A lot of great sources. Britannia, Encyclopedia in Britannia. I don't know which one that
Britannica,
goes.
yeah.
Britannica. That's how you say it. So just if you want to do further research, highly recommend these places. They give you, like, the Encyclopedia gives you a good synopsis. Some of these other places you can get more in depth, actually read some of the articles, newspaper clippings in the time. So
good stuff.
So yeah, in this First Continental Congress, they also draft a petition to King George outlining the colonists' grievances. So they've declared their rights. Now they're petitioning directly to the king. Parliament's going too far. And they agreed to form the Continental Association. So they're unifying, like trying to solidify their unification. And this called for a trade to boycott Great Britain.
And this is a big deal because they're right. Like this is like history for dummies, but it's like the Continental Congress and then this Continental Association is unprecedented because we're seeing the 13 colonies come together in a unified manner to say that we're going to have some type of like association with each other in a formalized way to be united against this cause.
Exactly. So they have their cause for liberty here. They plan, before they left, they decided to plan for a Second Continental Congress that would meet at a future date.
Cool.
So they do this. The Declaratory Act is still in place. They send this, and this is where things get rough because the king stops listening. He stops listening to the petitions that are now being sent to him. He's
ignoring the Continental Congress too, right?
Yeah, because they don't recognize that it has authority, right? And at least that's part of a big why they're doing this. So fast forward now, that's 1774. 1775, you have now in April, let's put it that way, in April 1775, the Sons of Liberty are still active in the city of Boston. Boston is under martial law at this point. They're having, like, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, several of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty had to flee the city because the British were going to arrest them. And these small villages and hamlets around the city of Boston, they are now training their militias, the Minutemen. I know everyone's heard about the Minutemen.
Yeah.
They're being trained to be ready at a minute's notice. And what you have that takes place here in April, the British, Thomas Gage orders Major Pitcairn, I don't remember his first name, but Major Pitcairn to lead troops into Concord and Lexington, or Lexington and Concord, because that's the order. You had to go to Lexington first, to go find the stashes of ammunition and firearms and cannon that the colonists had put together as a means of defense, and go raid those arsenals, burn the cannons, and also
go take their guns.
Exactly. But one of the main things he was sent to do is find Samuel Adams and John Hancock and arrest them. Try to squash the leadership of the Sons of Liberty and the Patriots. This is where we have the famous ride of Paul Revere,
Nice.
where he's waiting on shore watching the Old North Church that on the night of April 18th to see if he sees one lantern or two. And the one lantern would tell him if you see one if the British go by land,
Okay.
two if by sea.
Nice.
And it was two lanterns because the British were going to come across the harbor instead of go across Boston Neck. And they came across the harbor. He took off riding, and he did warn as he was passing houses and farms and small little villages, the British are coming. We get that picture. We hear that. The British are coming. The British are coming.
But the main purpose of that was to warn his boys.
To warn.
So they could get out of Dodge.
Yes, to warn John Hancock and Samuel Adams because they were going to get arrested.
Gotcha.
Right? So this leads up into the morning of April 19th.
Okay.
The Lexington militia has been warned. They've been called out. And I want to say there's only like 20 something of them out there against, it's not a regiment, but it's a company or two of British troops. I think one of the companies is Marines under Major Pitcairn. And he gets there. The British get there. The Americans, the Patriots are standing there under the command of John Parker, where he tells them, his orders to them are stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they want to have a war, let it begin here. I love that so much.
Yeah.
Just like, stand your ground, man. But if they want to have, don't fire unless fired upon. Let them start the war if they want to have it.
But we'll have it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're ready to defend what we've been talking about for the last 11 years.
They want to throw down, we'll throw down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I guess it's 10 years, but yes, exactly. And so Pitcairn gets there and he starts yelling at the Patriots, disperse, you rebels. Yeah. And then a shot is fired, and that's the shot heard round the world. And nobody knows who did it.
Yeah.
I'm inclined to say the British did it. I am biased.
I mean,
there's a lot of historical documents that say they did it,
right.
But there's others that say no, the British didn't. I'm just leaning with the documents that say they did it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can definitely get to it just logically of just like if the Continental Militia was given the order to not fire unless fired upon directly. And then also the reality is that the British have a precedent of, like we talked about the Boston Massacre, like where they have fired upon colonials before. Not that that was like super commonplace every day. They're just shooting people. But it's like, it seems like you could get to like, it's probably more likely that it was the British that fired first rather than the militia. But you know, definitively, maybe we're American bias, which we are. And we are. I don't care. Yeah.
I don't really care in this instance, but no
regardless,
one really knows.
Yep.
I'm just leaning with that the British fired first.
Yeah.
So this led to the Americans were fired upon by well-trained troops. They end up fleeing, and the British, they do what they need to there in Lexington. Then they move on to, they try to go to Concord, but when they get to Concord Bridge, they're met by a wall of American patriots. There's 1 to 2 volleys take place where they fire upon each other. And the British end up retreating at that point because they don't know. They're now in enemy territory. They don't know what's all out there. Every step of the way back to Boston, they are harassed by the American patriots, firing from every fence, rock, and tree. And they are these are farm boys who have been hunting their whole lives, just picking them off every chance they get. And this is guerrilla warfare all the way back. And the British would complain. I think there's writings, there's complaining of, I cannot believe the audacity of these Americans to not stand and let us shoot at them. Like, it's really that kind of talk coming. It's like,
the moment of realization, like, oh, we do this in a stupid way.
So, yeah, but that's going on all the way back to Boston. And it's not until George Washington takes charge and they surround Boston, and this is after the battles of Bunker Hill and stuff, that the British finally pull out of Boston. Yeah. And then they go to New York and it starts all over.
Nice.
So,
side note, could you imagine if we still fought like that today?
with our technology,
Yeah, a bunch of M4s and
there'd be nothing, nobody'd be alive. Because honestly, the way you just said that, the reason they did that in this time where they line up with each other and shoot at each other is because they didn't use rifles. So a rifle is rifling is a technique of putting a spiral inside the barrel that makes the ball or the bullet so much more accurate.
Yeah.
They used smooth bore muskets. And so that's just a smooth bore, a ball going through, and its range of being accurate is like 17 yards.
Yeah.
And then it just goes to the left or right like you wouldn't believe.
Right. So there's a practicality of like marching in that formation because the inaccuracy leaves room where you might be fine. And then there's just sort of the aspect of like that unity and like moving as a unit allows your unit to move forward with like confidence.
But you gotta realize armies have been doing that since the Romans.
The Greeks.
Well, yes.
Hoplites.
But I mean like Europe took it from the Romans. And England, even in medieval times, all the way up, they fought in formations. And even when they had the firearms, that's what I get so upset about all these Hollywood movies. They always want to get into these massive melees where nobody knows who's who. And it's like, that wouldn't have happened. No. They would have been in solid formation. And if you broke apart an enemy's formation, you would end up massacring them.
Yeah. And that's usually what it was. Like all the Roman stories are like they would break a legion and then it's like, it's just
over.
A free for all at that point.
Exactly.
Like they're just hunting people down. Like,
so like in this warfare where the guns aren't accurate, it's still beneficial because you can do the most damage. But you also got to realize the British techniques were usually fire 1 to 2 volleys and then charge with the bayonet. And so it ended up becoming a solid mass of troops going into your line. Not to get into military tactics of the American Revolution, but so that happens. Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world. The war has now started, and a Second Continental Congress is called.
Cool. Here we go.
And this one met from May 10th, 1775 to March 2nd, 1789. Well into after the war's over.
Yeah. They just never uncall it, right? Like they just go through the war of their nation and they just like are like keep meeting.
Well, this is what becomes they adopt the Articles of Confederation, the first real unity. And then in 1789 is because the Constitution's formed and we now have a federal government. Right. Yeah. So this just doesn't stop meeting.
Cool.
A note here, during this Second Continental Congress in July 6, 1775, they wrote the reasons for taking up arms, which don't want to get into, but I highly recommend that our listeners look into that. And we might do some episodes on that at some point because it's fascinating. They just really hammer on like, hey, we don't want to, this is before 1775. So independence isn't an idea yet. They're like, we don't want independence. We are defending ourselves from an out of control parliament. And we really wish the king would step in on our behalf. But they're the ones who sent the troops. They're the ones who are firing first. We're defending ourselves. And they really lay out the case publicly and officially. Right?
Cool. So we have here then next thing, June 7th, 1776.
So we're fast forwarding from July 6th, 1775 to June 6th, 1776.
We're
June
really
7th.
Close to the Declaration, guys.
We're getting really close, guys.
If you couldn't tell by the date, it's like, we're right there. We're right around the corner.
We're right here. So a gentleman in the Second Continental Congress stands up. His name is Richard Henry Lee, and he proposes a resolution that ended up becoming the Lee Resolution.
Cool.
And this is what it says. I'll actually let you read it if you wouldn't mind.
Okay. Yeah, not at all. So it states, resolved... Oh, sorry, I scrolled too far. That these united colonies are, and of right to be, kind of using that same language that the Declaratory Act did.
Exactly, from our last episode.
Free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. That it is expedient forthwith to take the most effectual measures for forming foreign alliances, that a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation.
Approbation.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're fine. Thank you for that. So yeah, this is how basic it was at first.
Mm-hmm.
And if any of our listeners have ever read the Declaration of Independence, you'll be like, I've heard some of that language before, because they adopted this resolution in part of
into
that.
the Declaration,
right?
Yeah. And
So-
this is but this is a big deal.
Yeah,
I mean, this is a very big deal.
this is an official call now
Mhm.
to declare independence, because up until this time, it had been talked about, rumblings, some hotheads were talking about it, but as Britain just keeps pressing on in their oppressive acts, this is like the first official call. Well, first, I want to say it this way, first continental official call, because there were individual colonies, like Rhode Island declared themselves independent before this. And I think there's a county in, oh gosh, was it North Carolina or South Carolina? That declared that they wanted their delegates to call for independence. So, but this is the
Probably
first.
South Carolina. Rabble rousers.
Yeah, probably. This is the first official call in the Continental Congress. All right, guys, we need to go ahead and just become independent.
And so this is a resolution. So this is like actually, is it fair to say that this is the legal decision on behalf of
this is becoming the legal decision,
right? Whereas the Declaration of Independence is just the formal, like,
so
declaring.
Let's put it this way: the Declaration of Independence is what houses this. This is in it. So the Declaration, in that sense, is the legal breaking away. It's the legal resolution, the legal declaration. So the Declaration is the resolution.
Gotcha.
That it
because
becomes that.
there's sort of there's a line in the Declaration that basically that says something to the effect of like, you ought to declare to your former government that you don't belong to them anymore, right? Am I making that up?
No,
or
you're
I'm
not
just
making that
pulling
up. That's just not exactly
that's a
how.
bad paraphrase
that's a very
of it,
bad
but
paraphrase.
you get my point behind that. It's like they're saying that like you should like formally absolve the ties with them,
right? At the very beginning of it, they not to get too much into it yet, but at the very beginning of it, they are saying we owe it to the world to tell you why we're doing this.
See.
Yeah,
that's what I said.
Yeah, exactly. Great paraphrase.
Yep.
And then in the end, the language here resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved.
Yeah.
Like that part is like worded a little differently, but it's at the end of the Declaration of Independence. Because the Declaration is it's a formal statement of like, here's our principles of government that we're basing this resolution off of. Here's the acts of tyranny that the king has committed that gives us justification for this resolution. Here's the resolution. Oh, by the way, we're depending on God for this. So that's a short synopsis of what comes out of this resolution, this Lee resolution from Richard Henry Lee.
That's awesome.
So he calls for this. He stands up, proposes this, and everybody's like, "Uh-oh, are we are we really about to do this?"
Yeah.
And they decide to take 3 weeks to basically get everybody, all the delegates there, to contact their colonies, their state governments, because they're not states yet, so colonial governments. To I wanted to say something. I want to correct something I just said. Before this had happened, not too long before, the Continental Congress told the colonies, "Hey, you need to write new constitutions and form new governments for your colonies." Basically, it's a preemptive step of like, "Hey, independence is probably going to happen. You need to be something new. You need to be your own functioning country, your own functioning state."
Gotcha.
All right. So this gets proposed. This is that first formal. They take 3 weeks so they can get back in touch with those colonies. Like, hey, do we actually want to declare independence? Do we, like, we're your delegates. Do we have authority to vote for this? Comes up to July 1st. July 1st, there's a vote for independence, and it fails. And it fails because Pennsylvania and South Carolina vote
Swing
against
states.
declaring independence. Yeah, swing states, really.
Not South Carolina's not really a swing state anymore, but
Yeah, no.
Pennsylvania is for sure.
Yeah. Talking about the recent election, it sure is.
I feel like in the last 3 months, I've just heard the word Pennsylvania. 5 million times.
It's so crazy, especially when you look back to why they founded Pennsylvania. It's still so important. And Independence Hall is in Pennsylvania.
Is there? Yeah,
Yep.
100%.
So Pennsylvania and South Carolina vote against it. And New York abstains because New York, they hadn't heard back from their constituents. Delaware is a split vote.
Okay.
So I think each state put forward 3 delegates, so that way they could kind of have a tiebreaker. And one of Delaware's delegates is not there, and I'll get to him in a second.
Gotcha.
July 2nd comes around. There's a vote for independence, and it passes.
Whoop, whoop.
South Carolina and Pennsylvania changed their votes. New York still abstains because they haven't heard back. And
Get your
Delaware,
crap together, New York.
right? And Delaware, obviously they went along with it. I want to they abstained.
Spoiler
they didn't hear
alert.
back. Yeah. They do go along with it. And the reason this was important, and the reason it failed, is because this was a vote, and they decided it had to be unanimous if they were going to do it. They weren't going to just half of us do it and half of us not.
Right.
So New York abstains. Delaware, that was split, is now changed because of the arrival of that last delegate, and his name was Caesar Rodney.
Okay. You said this guy's really cool. I'd never heard of him until you brought it up.
Well, he is really, really cool because Caesar Rodney, he was back in Delaware. He had skin cancer. It was pretty bad. He actually had to wear things to cover that part of his face because it was on his face, right?
Phantom of the Opera situation.
Maybe.
That's how I'm imagining it.
Yeah.
It's like all these things I keep telling you. This is my version of it now. I'm picturing the guy from Phantom
Whatever
of the
makes
Opera.
you keep it in your mind.
Okay.
You're just
Gotcha.
Just change it a little bit to make it accurate, and you're good.
Okay. Nice. Yeah, I'm not going to do that.
I know
He's
you're
the Phantom of the Opera. Got it.
So, but Caesar Rodney's back in Delaware. After that first vote fails, they send somebody to go get him. So the carrier, he gets there, and it's late at night, and he tells them, "Look, you've got to come back. They're going to vote against independence if you don't." And he gets on his horse immediately, and he rides like the wind back to Philadelphia. He rides through a thunderstorm that night.
Jeez.
And he gets in just in time, sits down. They're calling the vote. He stands up. Delaware is for independence.
Wow.
And
didn't you say something like he chose to do that? His other option was basically to go to England to have his cancer operated
at
on?
the time, there was a doctor in England who had successfully operated on the same type of cancer and could have saved his life.
Wow.
And by voting for independence that day for the good of his country, he literally is signing away the chance to live.
Jeez.
So
Just a true patriot.
Yeah,
man.
true patriot.
That's awesome.
That's somebody you should honor and respect because we wouldn't have our country today without somebody like him.
Yeah, that's crazy, and nobody knows who he is.
Yeah, nobody does, which is really sad.
Poor guy.
We all should know. So, yeah, that, like I said, it passes, and there's a mini series out called John Adams. Something HBO
Who's that
put
about?
out. Don't do that to me right now. That's like Justice with who's so and so Junior's
Marvin
dad.
Harrison Jr.'s dad?
Yeah. Marvin loses.
Yeah. I love it.
Yeah. So John Adams miniseries. I've watched a good chunk of it, a couple of the episodes, and it's all right. But the episode on independence, when they call for the vote and it passes, I think a lot of people have it in their mind. And I love the way this miniseries does it because I think this is more accurate. I think the way a lot of us hold it in our minds, they pass and they can jumping up and down, cheering,
like
patting each other
beers.
back. Yeah, exactly. It passed and the room is silent. In the miniseries, and I think that's more accurate. And they're just sitting there like, what have we done?
Yeah, it's the somber gravity of what they're embarking on.
We just signed our death warrants and declared war on the greatest military power in the world.
Yeah.
takes a lot of courage, guys, for what these men did. Yes, we should celebrate with, John Adams said, fireworks and bonfires and days of praising and thanking God. He actually had that in what he said we should celebrate. So it should be celebrating. But just remember, it was a heavy weight that they took upon themselves, where many of them lost family. Some of them lost their lives, were hunted down for the entirety of the war, being hunted by the British.
Yeah.
And one of the guys, he had personally taken out loans to finance the entirety of the war, ended up in debtor's prison after the war.
Wow.
Because he couldn't pay the debts back.
Jeez.
So these guys, and when we get to the end of it, where it talks about where they say in the end of the declaration, and for the support of this declaration with a firm reliance upon divine providence. So we're relying on you, God. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They meant it.
Yeah.
And we are the beneficiaries of it today.
It's a true, like, literally the price of liberty.
Right.
In action.
So this is the Declaration of Independence is written by Thomas Jefferson. They vote on independence on July 2nd, July 4th. They sign the Declaration of Independence. And yeah, that is where we're going to come to the part where you wanted to talk about the Tories, the loyalist perspective. But no, it is important to get that perspective too, because like John Dickinson was one of the guys from Delaware who was voting against independence. He wanted to reform and cause reconciliation.
Right.
He went with it. He went with, I said Delaware, didn't I? He was Pennsylvania. I'm sorry.
That's how I was like confused for a second. So wait a second. But yeah, Pennsylvania.
He went with it after it passed, but he opposed it until it was passed.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. Like, we've gotten to this point where we've reached independence, but, just kind of fascinating this other aspect of it, of this group of people, like the Tories or the loyalists, the people who are supposedly loyal to the crown. And, it wasn't like just a small, tiny percentage of the people who were in the colonies. There's, from this quote I have from this historian, that they think it was somewhere close to like a third of the people living in the colonies would have considered themselves loyalists or Tories.
And a third considered themselves patriots, and the other third was like, we don't care.
Yep.
No, seriously, it only took a third to lead to independence.
Yep. But I think it's also important. And so why I think this is like actually essential to learn if you're going to learn the history of independence is that the Tory perspective, as I've understood it, doing a little bit of research, is it wasn't this sort of like this group who was just in favor of everything that Great Britain did. Right. It wasn't this group that was just like, yeah, their laws are great and all the taxation is just great without representation, and we don't even want representation. Who wants that? You know what I mean? Like, that was not their perspective at all.
Sure.
It's probably more accurate to say that in its best form, the Tory perspective is one of like reformation as opposed to separation or independence. And so the idea is like, we acknowledge ourselves as British subjects, and we want to stay under the rule of British law. Right. And, essentially just consent to what Britain is asking of us. And why I think that's interesting is I feel like that's actually the view at first of everyone.
It is. Absolutely. Nobody even thought about independence until it probably was starting before the Intolerable Acts, but those are the ones that really sent them over the line.
Yep. And so I just find that really fascinating. And then I'm remembering from our research, I don't remember like the names, but there's a couple of gentlemen who basically sort of flip sides throughout it. You know what I mean? They like you talked about the guy from Pennsylvania who's like votes against independence, but then eventually sides on it. Right. So it's like this development, this process over the, like these events, and I would say, leads to that.
Sorry.
No, you're good. And really where I think it boiled, or I guess this is my takeaway, like just sort of analyzing this historically, is really the linchpin of what flips the situation between Britain and the colonies to a point of no return. Like the point of no return is the Declaratory Act.
Yeah.
Because the Intolerable Acts, obviously those were like these really big things, the quartering, the Boston Tea Party, all of these like really big events in this like process. But the Declaratory Act was this sort of like statement where it really was like this ultimatum basically given by the British Parliament of like, you will either consent to this in its various forms or things will escalate.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately what we've seen as we looked at this history, right? Is that eventually it turns to this point where they institute martial law and all this kind of stuff to, prosecute that act, which they put into place.
Exactly.
And so that's kind of like, I found this really fascinating, interesting, researching the loyalist perspective is like, that ultimately becomes what the debate is about, right? Is it's like, are we going to submit to that or not? And then, those calling for independence, the patriots are like, no, that is tyranny.
Right.
You are consenting to tyranny.
Right.
And the loyalists are kind of like, well, we just don't, in a sense, really want to, like, we don't want to go down this road. And I think you can sympathize with that, you know what I mean? To a point where it's like, we had it good, we want to keep it good kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the independence movement is like, yeah, but we've gone past that.
It's not good anymore.
Yep.
Right. And I think that's a fair thing to think about. Like, if you were in their shoes, right? You're just living life. But here comes all these things that keep happening. And they really are, and first you might be thinking like, this is just abstract stuff. Like it's not really affecting me. But then if you're living in the town of Boston and these troops are like basically becoming gangs in your street and hurting your people, and it's just becoming an issue, and you're having to put up with them in your houses. Yeah. And it's like, wait a second, what? And then they can now come, their custom officials can come into your house whenever they want during the day, and your warehouses at night. They can do it without you even being around to look for things that may or may not be against the law.
Yeah, to look for contraband.
Yeah, exactly. Like these things are like, wait a second, this is actually affecting me now. So it's not just this abstract ideas about liberty and stuff. These are actual tangible. They have infringed my liberty, my right to privacy, my right to property, right? So, yeah, you come to the place of, do I want security and safety and not have to worry about it? Or is it something worth risking everything for because liberty is something very precious from God? Yeah. And the Patriot said something's very precious. This is worth this struggle, this fight. And the loyalists, if they were wanting safety and security, they ended up siding with the British troops, and the British, part of their strategy was to get them to become malicious and fight against the colonists, and it happened a lot in the South. So they may have been like more for Reformation at the beginning, but they just, it seems at some point, at least a lot of them just completely, nope, we're just going to go whatever the king says, and we're actually going to become now instruments of of the Parliament's unlawful power. Yeah. And so, yeah.
Well, as it escalates, right? It's like those kind of things become like, most of the times, like there's a point where you can't really not pick a side anymore. Right. It's like there, because both sides are going to force you basically to pick a side. Exactly. Because I know, both sides are trying to like get troops wherever they can too.
No, you're right. You're right.
But that's really cool, man. That perspective I think is super cool, and just like what we've looked at with the Declaration and this, I really love the picture you painted of like this, the signing of the vote for independence. Yeah. And these, guys having this, like, they're aware to as much as they can be of this historic moment. Yes. While it's happening, they're like, we know that this is different. We know that this is changing the course of history. We don't know how it's going to turn out, but it's happening.
And I think Yeah, I recommend, if you haven't seen it, you can probably find it on YouTube. Just it's like a 5-minute clip.
Yeah.
Watch it. It'll put a new perspective in your mind. Like, oh wow.
Yeah.
But I think it's something, as we're going through this, like I'm getting more of it, and I've been reading this as we discovered. I've been looking at this stuff since I was 4 or 5 years old. But I even like the research for this is like, when I really stop to think about it, I grow an appreciation for what they sacrificed so we can have a conversation like this today, enjoying our liberty and having a free man's podcast. Right?
Yeah.
So, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it's also pointed that we're discussing the sacrifice of these men today being Veterans Day. I don't know when our listeners are going to get this episode, probably sometime in January, but
we recorded on Veterans Day.
Yeah, we recorded this one on Veterans Day, and I just think it's important that no matter what time of year it is, that we are grateful for the sacrifices of those who have gone before us, that we can have the liberty and rights that we have from God protected in government, by our laws.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's good. I was listening to a podcast in preparation for this, and it wasn't a very good podcast, but the guy on there, this historian that was talking, was like, yeah, it's this really funny thing about the American founding, or not even the American founding, he's like the history of America. He's like, I like to call it, the happenstance of leadership. And then he proceeds to go through all of these, like George Washington and, Thomas Jefferson being there to write the Declaration, and George Washington being there to lead the Continental Army, and then Abraham Lincoln being there to like be the president that the country needed in the Civil War to like reunify us. And then and then the Depression hits, and then FDR happens to come and like lead us against the Nazis. Like, he lists all of these different things, right?
It's happenstance, right?
And then he says it's a happenstance. And then the other host goes, he's like, yeah, it is kind of this wacky thing that like whenever America needed it, there was always like this leader rose to the occasion. And I was just like, you guys sound like idiots,
right?
Like, you are supposed to be educated people. And so it was just, my biggest takeaway is God's providence first and foremost.
Yes.
But also the fact that you were talking about sacrifice. And that's why I was reminded of this, about how it wasn't happenstance that these men did what they did.
Right.
It was them, in some type of submission to what they felt like God's providence was leading them to do.
The conviction of their conscience.
Yep. The conviction of their conscience to willingly step up into that leadership that was needed at the time, and willingly make that sacrifice for their people. And so I just thought that was just so ridiculous. It's like, it's not happenstance. It's like the wills of individual men who are willing to stand up and fight for the things that they believe are true and for the good and betterment of others.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know. I think that point you made about sacrifice was just spot on.
No, I appreciate that. And I think that that's something that we do need to take into consideration. And just on that point, like even the First Continental Congress, this is they're dealing with the Intolerable Acts at the time, right? And they're getting ready to pass all those resolutions we talked about and declare like, hey, we have the same rights as Englishmen. You've gone too far. All those types. They petition the king. This is before independence. The very first motion in that Congress, so a gentleman makes a motion to do something. The very first thing they decide to do is they start with prayer. And the prayer lasted for 2 hours. They get a preacher from the town. He comes in and
Patrick Henry.
No.
Patrick Henry is not a minister, we learned.
No, yes, he's not. Thank you for that. His name was Reverend, I don't remember his first name, but Reverend Duché.
Okay.
Right. Which he's a controversial figure.
Yeah.
But he leads them in prayer for 2 hours.
Yeah.
And
it's so crazy.
The writings from the guys in the room talking about how inspired they were. And that was also something, you talk about providence. The Psalm of the day, because they were using the Common Book of Prayer, and they had a Psalm of the day to go along with that. I believe was Psalm 35, which talks about rising up for me, O Lord, and defend me against those who've come against me, and all these types of things. And John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail and was like, I can't tell you how inspiring that was, and to think that was coupled with that common book of prayer like 200 years before to be that day.
Yeah.
And you can't happenstance, man.
It's just wacky.
It's so dumb. Like, how blind do we have to be to not acknowledge God's providential hand and mercy to raise up the right kind of leaders in the right time, right? That is God's mercy. I don't care who you are.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and it's just crazy, right? It's like to think about, like, you know, regardless of what you think about, I mean, most of your people who listen to this podcast are all believers, right? But it's like, well, even if you weren't, you know, to imagine our Congress today before an issue came up, there was a massive issue, all coming together, both sides of the aisle, and saying we are going to, like, submit ourselves to a higher authority in humility.
Yeah, submit ourselves to God,
right,
like they did.
And would be unthinkable. You know?
It would be unthinkable, but maybe some wisdom would come out of that Congress, right?
I know. It's just like, it's amazing. Like, you see that. It's like the humility that they had, the willingness to sort of, like, actually, like, be like, no, let's pray over what we're doing.
Yeah.
It's profound.
Yeah. So on that note, as we are closing, I think it's 1st or 2nd Timothy. I think it's 1st Timothy, where we are instructed as believers to pray for governing authorities. So let's pray for them. Let's pray that they would actually turn back to God.
Let's pray that they'll pray.
Exactly. No, honestly, let's do it. Let's commit ourselves to that, especially as we're about to get a massive new administration, Senate, and looks like House of Representatives at this point. Let's pray for them.
Yep.
Let's pray that God would raise up these leaders to be men that fear him and know him, and who will love him, and also who will administer righteousness and justice in an impartial way for all the people, and who will defend and protect the rights and liberties of the people that God's given us, and that they will defend and protect the people.
100%. Let's
pray that they do what God has told them to do.
Yeah.
And raise them up to do that we've elected them to do.
Yep.
Right?
That's good stuff.
So, yeah.
I got nothing else. That's it. Yeah.
No, I appreciate you bringing
up final word.
All that about the loyalists. It's good to bring it back in and be like, yeah, there's this other thing going on with all this. So I appreciate that. As we go into the next episode of this series on the Declaration of Independence, we are actually going to finally get to the Declaration of Independence. And we're going to read it, and we're going to break it down and look at the different parts and what were they saying and how we can use it today as a standard to judge if our government's in line with what's right and good for government or if it's not.
Yeah.
So looking forward to that, and can't wait to do it with you.
Yeah, I can't wait, man. It's going to be awesome. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for doing it, man. And we appreciate you guys listening. God bless y'all. Thank you for listening to the Free Man's Podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe for more great episodes coming your way soon. For more information and to sign up for exclusive bonus content, you can visit our website, thefreemanspodcast.com. Thanks again for listening, and God bless y'all.